Good morning. I'm Ivo Daalder, the president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and this is World Review, where each week on Fridays we will look back on the week and what was happening in the world with prominent journalists from around the world. I'm very pleased today to have with us Carla and Robbins, who is the Marx Faculty Director of the MIA program at the Marx School at Baruch College, and also an adjunct senior fellow on the Council on Foreign Relations, a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist with long-standing journalistic experience back for the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and other publications. Carla, great to have you from New York.
It's great to see you, Ivo and Steve and Edward.
Steve Erlanger is the chief diplomatic correspondent in Europe for the New York Times, and he joins us today from Brussels. Hi, Steve.
Hello, Ivo. Hi, everybody.
Edward Luce, the U.S. national editor and columnist for the Financial Times, joins us today from Washington, D.C. Great to see you, Ad.
Likewise. Thanks, Ivo.
Well, a lot of things to talk about today. Let's start off with one of the big stories in the week, which was the decision by President Trump to suspend funding for the World Health Organization, organization that's been around since 1947, dealing with infectious diseases for many, many years. Ed, why this decision and why at this particular point in time, given that we're dealing with a pandemic for which the WHO, of course, has strong capabilities and responsibilities?
Well, I think the timing is political. We're getting into the phase here in the United States in terms of who is to blame for America's late response to the coronavirus. And therefore needlessly high mortality rates. And President Trump is very much trying to pin the blame, some would argue scapegoat, the WHO. As you mentioned, Ivo, the WHO has been around for a long time. It has a very good record of dealing with not so much pandemics or epidemics, but of persistent diseases like polio and TB, smallpox. And even during the height of the Cold War, the USA and the USSR collaborated through the WHO to eliminate smallpox. So it's got this track record, not quite as good a track record on pandemics. So it was criticized quite heavily for being late on the Ebola outbreak in 2013, 2014 in Western Africa. And it's been receiving quite a lot of legitimate criticism in the past 2-3 months for essentially following China's narrative on the outbreak in Wuhan and being a little bit late to declaring this as both a human-to-human transmission virus, which it got to mid-January, but also a global pandemic. So there are some legitimate criticisms there of the WHO. And Donald Trump has picked up on them and vastly magnified them and essentially said that America will defund the WHO. The United States is the largest contributor. The second largest, interestingly, is the Gates Foundation. He said that America will defund the WHO. It's unclear what conditions would restore US funding. It's also unclear whether President Trump has the authority to stop that money going into the WHO because it's been authorized and appropriated by Congress already. But his essential argument is that the WHO was late to the pandemic and therefore they are to blame. And by implication, China, because the WHO was dancing allegedly to China's tune during January, that China is also to blame. And I think you have to see this in the context of a presidential election coming up in November, where the question of President Trump's competence, the fact that he doesn't really have much of an alibi for the whole of February and for the first half of March is going to be front and center of the election debate between him and Joe Biden, and blaming the WHO with some grounds, it should be said. This is not entirely fake news. Blaming the WHO is is something that plays very, very well with President Trump's base, even if it doesn't entirely fit the facts. And Trump's own record, I don't think I need to belabor on this, is negligent. He was praising China much more overtly for its handling of the coronavirus in late January, early February, even after he imposed the travel ban from China. Trump's sort of effusive praise for Xi Jinping and his predictions that America was fine, it was all contained, it would miraculously disappear, that is not a good record to be running on. So he's looking for a scapegoat, and the WHO stroke China is filling that role.
So, I think you rightly underscore that the WHO sort of parroted the line that was coming out of Beijing, which was a non-line for all too long in December, and particularly in the first 3 weeks of January. And I think that's right. But Carla, it's also true, right, that by the time the U.S. started to pay attention, the WHO had already said this was going to be a significant threat. In fact, it called it a global health emergency, I believe, on January 30th. And you had the Director General of the WHO saying the window is still open, but it's closing very rapidly, and everybody needs to get prepared. And that was in late January, early February, and we know what happened in all too many countries. It was ignored.
Well, WHO is like all international institutions. It's as strong or it's as weak as jealous God states will allow it to be. Particularly has the situation which it's dependent on the states for information. The Chinese were very resistant to sharing the genome, very resistant to telling them information. They weren't telling their own people. They weren't allowing American scientists in either, even though we had an exchange relationship with them. And the WHO, there's the problems, as Ed was saying, the problems they had with Ebola, the problems they've had again and again. States don't want to give out this information because they're worried about the impact on tourism. They're worried about the impact on investment. The Chinese are worried about the impact on their own people. They didn't tell their own people the truth, and they certainly didn't want to tell it to the world. And the WHO is captive to its members. China is also a big contributor. But I think more than anything else, if you look at it, after Ebola, they changed the rules and they put more responsibility on the states to fess up to the WHO. But as we all know in global governance, there's really no punishment if you don't do what you say you're going to do. And that's the problem with the WHO. It's an intrinsically weak global governance institution.
I remember, Steve, that you and I were in Munich in mid-February when the Director General of the WHO spoke. And one of he had already been criticized for being too China-centric at the time. And he said, I'm focused not on stigmatizing people or even the virus. I'm focusing on how do we get cooperation to deal with this disease, and calling people names at this point doesn't help me. What really helps me is to work with all the governments, and particularly the Chinese government, to try to get this under control. It seems to me an argument that made sense at the time and still makes sense today.
Well, I agree with that. I mean, part of the problem with any of these UN organizations is not every country is a democracy. And not every country wants to tell you what's going on. And a lot of countries are awfully paranoid, much as Carla said. I mean, they want to protect their economies. They want to protect their tourism industries. Quite a lot of the poorest countries rely on a lot of tourism. I mean, so it's a very difficult job. I mean, and frankly, I don't think the problems of the WHO, which are real, I mean, they were too close to China. They don't allow Taiwan to be a member. You know, there are lots of issues, but they're UN issues. Don't excuse the United States watching what was going on in China, watching what was going on in Italy, watching what was going on in Spain, and doing very little. I mean, that's really the issue. It's not like this was a surprise or it was the WHO's fault for not saying something. I mean, people looked at what was going on in China like some sort of Asian science fiction movie that had nothing to do with anybody else. And then they looked at Italy as some Italian screw-up that had nothing to do with everybody else. And in fact, This is the failure, I think, and it's the failure of all our big institutions, the G20, the G7, certainly the UN, the EU, the White House. It's been a very depressing show, which I think will do more to undermine multilateralism than anything Trump himself can actually do.
Steve, let's stick with you, because the next, so one debate is about how did this happen, who's to blame. The next big debate is how do we get out of it, and that has been done under the moniker of reopening our economies, unlocking the lockdown, as someone said the other day. And then, of course, the Chinese, because the disease was there first, were the first ones to start moving in this direction. The Europeans are now also starting to do this. We saw relaxation in Denmark with opening of kindergartens and schools, I believe, on Wednesday. Small shops being opened up in Austria. My sister, who lives in Italy, said that she was out getting plants because the plant stores were starting to get open. So slowly but surely, life's coming back. One of the remarkable things is these are countries that are all members of the European Union, and it doesn't seem to be happening in a coordinated fashion. What's happening in Europe in terms of reopening? Who's learning what lesson from who? And where do you think this is heading?
Well, very good, complicated questions. The EU is quite like the WHO. I mean, it is a function of its member states. I mean, it is allowed to do only what all its member states want it to do. It works by consensus. And what happened in the beginning was a complete panic. I mean, all nations panicked, and they all realized they were not sufficiently prepared. They didn't have enough masks. They didn't have enough ventilators. They didn't have enough personal protection. So they're shutting themselves down. Whether they were part of the EU or not part of the EU is immaterial. And in a way, it makes sense, because borders actually matter in a pandemic. Because if you're going to control the spread, you want to know who's coming and what condition they're actually coming to you in. So that's, allowed inside Schengen. It was an emergency. The problem was more the breakdown of the single market and the free trade of goods. Even the French nationalized all the masks in the entire country and all the hand sanitizer so they could distribute it, as a state function to make sure health people got it. So it's complicated. And the one thing, Trump struggles with, and I think he's right to raise the question, this is always a cost-benefit analysis. You've shut down your economies. You put people under house arrest. It's like your civil liberties are gone. And there's a period in which people will, because they're afraid of this invisible enemy, will obey you. But as things begin to loosen up, I think people are going to be quite angry. So every country is figuring out how to loosen up because they want to preserve their companies and their jobs. And I think the Europeans have done a better job than many in terms of state support for employers and employees. I mean, the states are paying much more of salaries, and they're trying to guarantee, at least for a period of time, that companies don't go under and don't have to fire people. And we'll see how that goes. But of course, as it ends up coming, assuming there's not a big second wave, there are going to be huge questions, this huge debt. I mean, the French struggle to keep under 3% of GDP as a yearly fiscal deficit. They're going to be 10% this year. There's talk Britain may be 14% of GDP. And at some point, someone will ask the question, well, who pays the bills? And who's going to deal with the aftermath? I mean, these are questions that will come later. So people are watching each other. I mean, it's actually a fascinating experiment, because to believe that our governments know what they're doing, I think, is a great leap of faith. I don't believe they do know what they're doing, because this is brand new. But to think that they're incompetent is too impossible. So we have to trust them.
So I want to just tell our participants who are listening in and watching us that they too can be part of this conversation. They can do so by going to their browser and type in ccga.live and submit a question there. You can also vote on questions that are already there. That gets them to the top of the list and more likely to be seen and answered. Back though to this really complicated and fascinating set of issues, Carla. To you, and when you think about this this lack of coordination that is happening, frankly, it's happening in our own country. If you take, we are the European Union, it's called the United States, and there are 50 members that happen to be the states, and we're all trying to figure out how to make this happen. Is there an advantage, perhaps, that as we see that countries are learning from other countries, and that they are trying to observe what is happening and making avoiding mistakes perhaps of some? Singapore opened up and that is now, you're seeing a massive increase in the number of people infected in Singapore, 450 people just yesterday, which is a massive increase for that small country. How do you see this?
Well, we're such an insular country, you don't hear a lot of conversation, you don't hear a lot of American governors saying, well, look at the experience of Singapore. But certainly from a public policy point of view, that if we had a responsive federal government, it would be tracking what is going on in other countries, because we do have the advantage of having come later. And there is the potential for learning there. The states here, some of the states are doing a better job. Probably the most interesting thing that's happened in the last few days is the compacts that are developing between East Coast states and West Coast states and now Midwestern states that have basically said, from a logical point of view, we share borders, we're going to have a common public policy, and we also are resistant to fiats that are completely incoherent that are coming out of Washington. So if there is a learning that's taking place, one hopes that it's taking place at the state level. But, closing down borders is a really interesting question here. To go back to the WHO, which had argued against it, now we seem to be learning that if you want to contain this, literally contain this, that you have to contact tracing very hard if you're going to have to have open borders. But how do you balance this with what Steve was talking about, with opening up an economy? You're talking about the 30% drop in world trade. Very hard to resume world trade if you're going to have closed borders. Very hard to restart an economy if you're going to have closed borders. These are the trade-offs as well. We can look at what happened with Singapore, and the default position is going to be keep those borders closed for as long as you can, which is another form of sheltering in place. These are really, really hard trade-off questions.
Ed, to you finally, before we move on to the next topic, how should we conceptualize this? The way the language we're using is that we're sort of we shut the economy, now we're reopening it, and we're going back to normal, maybe in stages. So the president's yesterday released this 3-stage plan that the CDC put forward, but the end stage is back to normal. Is that how it's going to happen? Is that what we're going to see?
No, I mean, I think if you talk to people with experience of this, like Ron Clay, who was head of the pandemic.
We're losing you, Ed. Ed, we're losing you. Technical problems. There you go.
Perfectly timed. This godly thing fell out of my ear. So what I was saying is if you talk to people like Ron Clay, who was head of the Ebola task force under the Obama administration, he talked to scientists. Clearly, the game here is to develop a vaccine. Now, in the meantime, there's a great importance and a lot of work going into developing better therapeutic treatments of people suffering from coronavirus. But ultimately, we've got to have a vaccine, and 75 to 80 to 85% of our populations are going to have to be vaccinated if they haven't already acquired immunity. So to open up in the meantime, whilst this race globally and collaboration globally is on for a vaccine, we've got to have a very comprehensive picture of testing, of how many people have got this, how many people are asymptomatic, of contact tracing linked to that. And I think if you look at countries that have begun very cautiously step by step to do some opening up and have announced it in the last few days, such as Germany. They've got very good testing. They've tested a considerably higher share of their population than the United States has. The United States has still tested fewer than 4 million people. It's barely 1% of the population. It's not enough to have any real confidence that we've got a map, a good enough picture of the extent of this disease, how it's being transmitted, at what pace, what the mortality rate actually is for the US to be following at this point in Germany's or South Korea's footsteps. South Korea is a very good model on this. So that's the concern, that there are some leaders, such as President Trump, who are not educating their publics about the nature, the reality of the road ahead. It's not like you were closed and now you're open. It doesn't work like that. This is a gradual, ad hoc, feel your way process. And countries like the United States and Britain, for that matter, are nowhere near a position of understanding the reach of this pandemic to start aggressively opening up yet.
So, I mean, just one thing I read today, I think Germany is testing 120,000 people a day, and has been for quite a while. We are now in the US testing about 145,000 a day. Germany is, of course, 4 times smaller than the United States. So that gives you one way of looking at it. Before going on to the next issue, Steve, one of the questions that came through refers to an interview that was done in Ed's paper with Emmanuel Macron, and his very strong statement that EU coordination and solidarity on this issue of how to deal with the crisis is absolutely vital for the future of the European Union. There was Macron tends to throw down these gauntlets. He did it at NATO before the NATO leaders meeting back last December. There's a pretty big one from the French leader who is pretty darn central to the European Union. How's the people in your town who are European Union related reacting to this, and of course in Germany as well?
Well, he did throw down the gauntlet. It's amusing that he threw it down in a very good newspaper, but one that is leaving the European Union at all.
Is there a tone of jealousy there, Steve?
No, I just think I hope the FD stays
what was he thinking
in Brussels.
That he didn't do it in the Times?
No. But Macron's the sort of person, he gets a 5-second question and gives a 5-minute answer. So the guy is a bit like Castro. He goes on and on and on. He says what he wants to say, and what he wants to say is basically a long-standing French argument, which is legitimate. It's been going on for some time, which is that the European Union and the Eurozone in particular must integrate further to save itself. It must do so economically. Normally, the French will do this saying that, of course, Germans and the Dutch should actually pay for what happens. So it creates a degree of resentment. But what he's using this pandemic and also climate to say that these are really big challenges that cross little country lines, and we have to integrate, and we have to, as a gesture of solidarity to countries badly hit who have not been in the north, who've been like Italy and Spain, that we really need to help them. Now, everybody agrees they need to help them. They're just arguments about what sort of money you actually use to help them with. And it's been an old French argument, which he's using this as a new reason to argue for, which is collective debt, which is some kind of European bond. Now that would involve a change in the actual treaty, which is not going to happen. And it would involve perhaps another year's worth of work, even if you had a treaty change. But he is shaming the Germans and the Dutch and others into providing significantly more support for Italy, Spain, and the others, and doing so, I think, in a very emotional and sincere way. I'm not saying he's insincere, not at all. But as usual, French see French interests as European interests. I mean, they make no distinction. Other people in Europe sometimes see it as more French interests than European interests.
Gaullism is hard to kill and hard to die, isn't it? Carla, another really big issue this week, and actually sort of surprisingly saw the President of the United States, not known for someone who conducts aggressive international diplomacy, actually doing so, reaching out to Vladimir Putin, to King Salman in Saudi Arabia to try to
to his posse, yes, yeah.
Well, but those are the guys he likes to talk with, right? But trying to get him to agree to reduce the output on oil of those two countries, not clear, and committing the United States to reducing the output of its oil in order to find a way to stabilize, if not actually increase prices. So far, doesn't look like it's at least doing that. Even as production is falling, prices are continuing to fall to historically low levels. But what can we learn from this engagement by the president in the intervention in the oil markets, and where does the oil market go from here?
So on Sunday, this group OPEC plus, OPEC plus Russia, agreed to what is the largest production cut ever negotiated, which is an attempt to stabilize oil prices and the related financial markets. They agreed to slash 2.7 million barrels a day in May and June, and then some tapering if possible after that. It's 10% of global output. And the deal brought together, as you said, three of the globe's biggest egos, Putin, MBS in Saudi Arabia, and President Trump. And the fact that this deal was cut with almost no post hoc trash talking shows exactly how desperate the situation is in all three countries. I think the big question is whether a 10% cut is going to be enough, with global demand expected to drop potentially by a third. I mean, if you're going to calculate it based on global trade, and OPEC is saying in a monthly report it expects global demand to contract by 6.9%, which is delusional, but okay. It has not raised prices, but it has slowed the crash somewhat. People were, worrying that single digits potentially. Yesterday, oil, when you think about it, what six years ago was $100. Starting this year was 60. Now it's somewhere between 20 and 30, depending on which you're looking at itself. And what this came from in the first place was a major face-off between MBS and Putin, driven by Putin himself, that OPEC Plus, which is based on the notion of controlling production, and the Russians had been cheating all along. But when the global economy started slowing down, the Saudis said, cut it out. The Russians have problems. It's harder for them to turn their wells off and on for a variety of reasons having to do with geology and having, I gather, oil wells. I'm not an oil expert at all. And Putin decided to call the Saudis bluff, and in part also because he thinks the Americans have been free riding on this, because the Americans aren't part of OPEC Plus, and with their reductions in production, the prices go up, and the Americans get to sell their oil as well at higher prices. And he thought he could face it off. Their budget is based on a much lower number for oil, about $45 a barrel. The Saudis are based on 80, and he thought he could pull it off. And then everything slowed down, including his ability, what he thought was going to be able to control the coronavirus. And now, while they have lower numbers, if you believe their numbers, than everybody else in Europe, but their numbers are growing. And he finally decided that he was going to have to back down with the help of Donald Trump. What the president committed to, who knows? He said he would take up a little of the slack from the Mexicans, who were going to stand in the way of the deal as well. But we don't really know whether the U.S. committed to any cuts. The Energy Department says that there's going to be a natural drop-off of American production anyway, a pretty major drop-off. And I suppose the thing that fascinates me more than anything else about this is if he got them to cut a deal and we really didn't make a commitment of our own, wouldn't you expect that Donald Trump would be out there gloating, like beyond belief? But he hasn't been doing it. Maybe because he knows how incredibly important this is for the U.S. economy, or maybe because he really, really likes these guys and he doesn't want to stick his finger in their eyes. So we really don't know what the U.S. committed to here.
Ed, help me understand where the U.S. interest is in this. For decades, what Americans have wanted most is cheap gasoline. And one way to get cheap gasoline is cheap oil prices. And so if you have low oil prices, why are we, as the U.S., leave aside Donald Trump, trying to get a way to raise oil prices? Where's the interest for the United States in that?
So with all commodity prices, but in this case, oil and gas prices collapsing because of, as Carla outlined very well, the collapse in global demand, that's putting a lot of these shale oil fracking businesses in America out of business. They can't survive this for too long. We've had a lot of bankruptcy filings already. They need a much higher price floor for their operations to remain economic. And, they are a large part of the economy in places like Texas, but also in the Dakotas, Pennsylvania, some key areas of the electoral map. And the oil and gas industry is also a very big supporter in general of the Republican Party and President Trump. So propping up the price is his way of trying to keep them in business. It's not unreasonable. It's a fascinating philosophical question. Has the United States already de facto joined OPEC Plus? Does this deal between MBS, Putin, and Trump possibly signal the fact that America is changing its decades of history of ignoring this Middle Eastern cartel to actually join it in some form? And if that's the case, then the geopolitics of energy is going to change quite dramatically in the coming months. But I think the basic motive here is to keep American energy companies in business.
Steve, how's this playing out in Europe? Of course, aside from, I guess, the Norwegians and maybe the Scots once in a while, not a lot of oil being produced in Europe itself. You would expect, therefore, declining oil prices a good thing for the economy. How are the Europeans reacting to this? Are they looking at it? How are they? And anything that weakens Russia, presumably, is also good. Let me add that as an issue for at least the people in Eastern Europe. How do Europeans look at this?
Well, as you say, they're very energy dependent. North Sea oil is pretty much gone. The Norwegians do okay, that's for sure. There's a certain amount, mostly gas, comes from Algeria, places like that. But Europe is very heavily Russia dependent. It just is. And it drives the Trump people crazy. Germans have gone ahead to try to build this Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which goes around Ukraine and goes around Poland. The U.S. has put sanctions on it. I think they're going to finish it anyway, but it's going to take them longer. So, the Europeans don't actually think too much about it, except in terms of diversification of supplies. And they tax it very high. It's much higher taxes in Europe than in the United States on gasoline. I mean, the price of energy, just to heat your house in a country like Belgium, which still has some nuclear power, is extraordinary. I mean, they're just really high prices. Gasoline prices are quite high. So, anything that keeps the price down, fine. But the economies are so ruined right now that oil isn't really the biggest factor right now, because people aren't driving and companies aren't actually manufacturing. So it's not the biggest issue here. Maybe it should be more important.
Well, I think that everybody has to set their priorities. Let me go to one other question that has come through from our listeners, which is on U.S.-China relationship and how we see that evolving. The degree of distrust that is emerging both within China, foreigners writ large, but the United States in particular, and here in the United States, where there seems to be this bipartisan agreement that the Chinese really screwed this up and they are to blame in many ways for what we're seeing, something we talked about earlier. How does that play out, Carla, with regard to is there an emerging Cold War? Is there an emerging kind of U.S.-China competition that has been accelerated by this particular pandemic? Relations weren't particularly good beforehand, but they seem to be moving in an opposite direction.
Well, I mean, since the end of the Cold War, only suspended because of 9/11, everybody's been waiting for China to be the next, near peer competitor. Certainly the Trump National Defense Strategy describes China as the long-range threat, and that we were going to build our entire defense spending around getting ready for this competition with China. Certainly that's the way the Pentagon thinks. The Pentagon is an entire one body of how it's all the China threat. I mean, even the rational people in the Pentagon talk that way, the entire focus of this. So that's been there all along. In fact, probably the greatest defender in the US government of China is Donald Trump. So as Ed said, focusing on the WHO is WHO/China. But, depending on the day, he's anti-China or pro-China. He campaigned heavily 4 years ago, talking about China, the greatest rape of American history, Chinese monetary policy, these things you never think you would possibly hear in an American campaign, because someone talking about monetary policy. So we'll see how it plays out in the campaign itself. One of the things, I get this daily aggregation called the Writing of RIGHTING of alt-right and right, center-right news organizations and what they're producing out there. And the biggest thing you read right now is how, coronavirus came out of a Chinese lab. And that's what the Chinese are saying about the Americans. And so that tells you something about the level of mistrust that exists there. So do I expect it to play out in the campaign? I think that's up to Donald Trump.
Ed, of course, you're running around, before you were locked up, you were running around the country trying to figure out what the country was thinking about politics in general, and of course the election in particular. China was already emerging as a bugaboo. We see now the Trump campaign really putting up the pressure on Biden as somebody who is too accommodating to the Chinese. How does this play out when in the same thing is happening on Capitol Hill, where the Democrats are as strongly against China on a whole series of issues as the Republican colleagues across the aisle? It's one of the things there's a bipartisan agreement on. How do you see this play out then politically in the U.S. and longer term? What is it going to mean for the relationship between these two countries?
It's interesting. The other day when Nancy Pelosi was talking about why it was not practical to do a remote convening of Congress. Clearly, Congress can't physically reconvene because the difficulties of 535 people getting into town and then going back and potentially spreading the virus. So Zoom, the platform we're on, was suggested as a way of doing remote congressional work. And she said, no, Zoom is China-owned. And in actual fact, it isn't. It's owned by a China-born US businessman based on the West Coast. But that was the sort of, that was a jerk response. It's like, it's not practical. There is no security online. I'll get to in 1 second to the politics of China and Beijing Biden, which is the new Trump campaign sort of moniker for Joe Biden. But look at what's happening mostly in Europe, to a lesser degree in the United States, with these transmission towers, these 5G transmission towers. You're getting a lot of vandalism in Britain, the Netherlands, Ireland, in many different European countries of these transmitters, because there is a belief that 5G is a China-invented medium to spread the contagion of a China-grown virus. So you've had vandalism of some of these towers that hospitals have put up, especially for people who are dying, to be able to talk to their relatives. And there is an extraordinary conflation here of the pre-existing suspicion of Huawei with this pandemic. And there's a sort of chemical reaction that you're seeing becoming quite sort of mainstream chatter on the right, not just the alt-right, in the United States as well. So in terms of how the politics of this is going to play, as as Carla mentioned, as you mentioned, we're at the backdrop here of pretty broadly across the board Sinophobia, strong anti-China feelings. And this Beijing-Biden tag, the idea that Joe Biden is soft on China, that his son Hunter profited, monetized his father's name when his father was vice president in China, I think is going to be front and center of this election campaign. I have no doubt about that. And Biden's going to have to, develop, particularly he's allowed to, emerge from his basement to do real campaigning in the Midwest. He's going to have a pretty strong argument as to, why when Trump mentions his voting record, why he voted for NAFTA, why he voted for China to join the WTO, why he was part of an administration that had TPP, that initiated TPP. And it's going to be thrown at him. The kitchen sink, the Chinese-made kitchen sink, is going to be thrown at him every day. So that's the kind of campaign I think we're going into.
Except, I mean, I can't imagine that this would be the most productive of campaigns, but certainly there are an infinite number of Donald Trump quotes you can throw back about expressing his abiding affection for Xi. And that is the one does wonder about Trump's sort of calculation there.
Yeah, there's always a tweet, and in his case, like 50 of them.
Yes.
Steve, that China was emerging until recently as this big issue in the transatlantic relationship, where the U.S. using the Huawei 5G debate was really pushing a line that said we need to separate from China as much as possible, and many of the Europeans just not prepared to be forced to choose between China and the United States, and trying to find a way to square that circle, which we saw, for example, with the British decision on Huawei's partial inclusion in the 5G network. And now on top of that, you have a virus that clearly did originate in China, but you also, a number of countries have had assistance by the Chinese, from doctors to masks to tests, not all of them working very well, as we're finding out in Spain and the UK and even in Italy. How is China now playing out in Europe as we're dealing with this issue?
Well, there's been a lot of ambivalence, and you're quite right. I mean, Europe, its great nightmare is to be caught between the United States and China and have to choose somehow, which it really doesn't want to do. And the sort of British decision on 5G is a good example of that. And now you have, with the virus, a sort of fairly big Tory backbench questioning about whether the government should actually rethink. But it's a very strong European-China relationship, particularly a German-China relationship, because a lot of Germany's exports, and Germany is an export-driven country, go to China. And if China's GDP is going to fall by 6% this year, it's a problem for Germany as well as for China. So there is a lot of ambivalence. There is this general hope, I think, that if Biden does win, that the United States and China will work out at least a more rational relationship. But everyone is really up in the air about it. I mean, you're quite right. It's a big problem. You can't cut yourself off. And there's a lot of discussion, I think, in the United States about decoupling from China. That is not a discussion Europeans are having. They think it's impossible. You can manage it. You can shorten supply chains. You can build more important things at home or inside Europe rather than rely on China for everything. Everyone's kind of shocked at the number of antibiotics that depend on China, so on and so on. So I think that will have a big impact on a form of globalized trade. But the idea that somehow China is going to go off somewhere else and be irrelevant to Europe, let alone to the United States, I think is just madness, personally.
Steve Erlanger of the New York Times, Carla and Robbins of the Council on Foreign Relations, Baruch College, Edward Luce of the Financial Times. Thank you all for joining us here this morning. I thought it was a fascinating discussion. This was World Review. We will meet every Friday, 10 o'clock Chicago time, 11 o'clock East Coast time, and whatever other clock it is in whatever place you are. Join us every Friday for World Review. In the meantime, thanks to Carla, Ed, and Steve. Be well, be safe, stay healthy.
You too.
Thank you.
Thank you. Be safe.